There's no law that says we have to have a central bank, it's just that we created one
Thomas
in
Jefferson.
1913. By an act of Congress, we established the Federal Reserve banking system, often nicknamed as the Fed. Now, we use that for a lot of different uses, but anytime you hear it in a bank or an economic context, the Fed is referring to the Federal Reserve banking system, the central bank of the U.S. All right, if you look in your textbook on page 209, there is the United States Federal Reserve System seal. Also on that same page, 209, there is a picture of the Federal Reserve Building, which is in Washington, D.C. In fact, it's just down the street from the White House. It was created by, like I said, an act of Congress in 1913. It has an enormous amount of power over our economy. Because it has so much power, it's very controversial. There are politicians who think we need to get rid of the Fed. There's politicians who think we need to rein in the Fed's power. There's other politicians who think the Fed's doing fine just the way they are. It's controversial. Some people go so far as to say the Fed is so powerful that it acts like a fourth branch of government. Well, I'm pretty sure you know there's three branches, right? Legislative, executive, and judicial. Some people say this is like the financial or economic branch of the government. That's silly. It is not a branch of the government. All right, the only power they have is the power that the legislative branch gave them when they created them. So there is a system of checks and balances in place. If the Fed was created with an act of Congress, what would it take to get rid of the Fed?
An act of Congress.
Another act of Congress. So whether or not you think they have too much power or not, it is not a fourth branch of government, and their power could be reined in easily enough. We're gonna outline the organization of the Federal Reserve.
Money.
The Federal Reserve is divided into districts, 12 regional districts.
Hunger Games.
If you look on page 210 in your textbook, you will see a map
We are in District 12.
of the 12 Federal Reserve districts. Everybody see that map on page 210? 12 different districts. Each district has a president
Who's our president?
of the Federal Reserve District. They have a president. Each district has a number, 1 through 12. Each district has a corresponding letter of the alphabet to go with that district. And each district has a headquarters where the Federal Reserve District Bank is located. So District 1 is where?
Maine.
Boston, Massachusetts, right? If anybody has a dollar bill, I don't have one, so does anybody have a
Yes.
$1 bill?
We do have a $1 bill.
Next to George Washington, there's a little round seal on the front,
Says F in the middle, or are we talking
says
about?
F in the middle, right? So it also, in every 4 corners, it has a number 6 in all 4 corners, does it not?
Yes, it does.
Because 6 is or F is the 6th letter of the alphabet. And if you read around that seal, it will say Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, Georgia.
Yep.
Yep, how did I know that?
Because we're in District 6.
Yeah, cause I'm looking at the map on page 210. And that's what District 6 is, that's what letter F stands for.
What district is Hawaii in?
12, according to the map.
I have a District 12 dollar.
There you go. So who runs the Federal Reserve? Great question. The Federal Reserve is run by a group of people called the Board of Governors. Who runs the Fed?
Board of.
You got that right. The Board of Governors consists of 7 members. 7 people on the Board of Governors. By the way, no 2 of them can come from the same district. The districts we're referring to are the ones on that map, those 12 districts on page 210. So these 7 members, no 2 from the same district, so that when they make decisions, they have input from various regions of the country who may have different economic interests, right?
Sounds cool to me.
The Fed's Board of Governors has a term of 14 years. Once they're appointed, which by the way, they're selected by the President of the United States. The President selects these 7 people. And once they're selected, they get to stay for 14 years. Now, just so you know, most of them don't stay 14 years. The average term is like 6, 7, 8 years. Right? And then they retire and go back into the private sector, because obviously the people on the Board of Governors are very brilliant financial minds. So they can make a lot more money in the private sector than working for the government, right, the Federal Reserve Bank. Well, when they leave and there's years left on their term, whoever's president gets to appoint their replacement, but the replacement doesn't get a fresh 14-year term, they just get to finish out what's left of the term. Now, when a term finally does expire, then the president gets to appoint somebody, and that somebody could stay for 14 years, they just usually don't. Everybody understand that, how it works?
Mm-hmm.
What does the Board of Governors do? Great
Right.
question. They do a lot of things, but one of the main, most important things they do is they set the required reserve ratio. New term, new concept. Here's what that means. We kind of already have learned about that. You know, when you deposit your money in your local bank doesn't just sit on it and wait for you to come on Friday night and withdraw it, right? What do they do with it? What do they do with your deposits, my deposits? They lend it. A lot of times to business firms, right? That would be called financial capital. What does a business use that money for?
For real
Purchase
capital,
real
which
capital.
is
What's
the
real capital?
tools of production.
Tools of production, and that's how businesses grow and expand, and that's called economic growth, job creation, right? GDP, the wealth is improved because the money is getting distributed where it needs to go. Well, we understand all that already, we studied that. But I think you know the bank, our local bank can't lend out all of their deposits. What if they lent out every single dollar, and then we come on Friday night and wanna get some cash out? We can go get some pizza or whatever, and they say, sorry, we loaned it all out. Not okay. Alright, so the required reserve ratio is the percentage of the deposits that the bank is required to keep on hand.
This is where it's at.
How much of all that money that's deposited, the percentage they have to keep in the vault is set by the Board of Governors.
So it's different for each state, or for each? Region?
No, I think it's the same
They all
nationwide. I'm
agree.
not sure about that, but I think it's the same nationwide. So what that percentage is, say 10% or whatever. So they can lend out 90% of their deposits, but they gotta keep, say, 10%, if that would be the reserve requirement, that's the amount of the money. So if you deposit $1,000, they can lend 900 of it, but they gotta keep 100 in the vault. Just in case, because people are gonna want some money to withdraw once in a while, right?
What if,
Yeah.
so how much money can you withdraw at a time? Cause what if someone like wants to withdraw more than?
Doesn't it depend?
Well, if you have $1,000 in the bank, you have $10,000 in the bank, you have $100,000 in the bank, whose money is it? Yours, you can withdraw all of it anytime you want,
at once?
at once.
But what if you're like really rich and everyone else in the bank is not really rich, and then you take like 100,000, but like the percent that they needed to keep was
Yeah.
around the same amount that you had?
We'll
You
get to
take it
that.
all.
We're actually gonna get to that.
Okay.
Good question. Yeah, you can withdraw your money and tell them you want it all in 20s.
I thought you
Ones.
could, I thought you had to withdraw like
You want it in quarters.
at a
whatever.
certain time. Huh, I didn't know that.
All right, next fact. Besides the Board of Governors, there is another group on the Federal Reserve called the FOMC. That stands for the Federal Open Market Committee. So obviously it's a committee of people. What do? They affect the money supply. Now I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking because I can read your mind. You think the money supply, I'm talking about that paper money, right?
No.
That ain't the money supply. Alright, that's called currency. The money supply is way more than just the currency. And the FOMC affects that money supply. In other words, they can expand it or contract it. And I don't mean they print more or less dollar bills. That ain't what I'm talking about. They have other ways to affect the money supply. Oh, they have ways. You wanna know what those ways are, but I'm not gonna tell you yet, cause you're not ready for that yet. But I'll tell you sooner or later, just not right now. There's 12 members on the FOMC. It has 7 on the Board of Governors. Federal Open Market Committee has 12. Who are those 12? Well, 7 are from the Board of Governors, so if you're on the Board of Governors, you're all automatically on the FOMC as well. Plus 5 other district presidents, so that makes 12. Always including the president from district number 2, letter B, headquartered in New York City. Think you figured out, probably know New York City is kind of like unofficially the financial capital of our country, like Wall Street, right? Not officially, but unofficially, it's kind of the nerve center, the financial capital of the earth. So that district president will always be on the FOMC, because they're kind of the middle of it all. And again, what they do is they affect the money supply, and we're gonna get to how they do that. The way Congress set up the Fed is they made sure that the Federal Reserve is politically, financially, and operationally independent. The Federal Reserve Bank, again, it's not part of the private sector. It's not a for-profit bank. It's just the U.S. government central bank. And we want to keep it politically independent. Here's how we do that. Alright, because we know that Congress is all about politics, right? Republicans and Democrats. The president is all about politics, Republican or Democrat. We don't want the central bank to be about politics. They're affecting the money supply, and the money supply has an absolute direct effect on how our economy's doing. So we don't want that to be tied up between Republicans and Democrats, because whoever's in power wants to get credit for a good economy, and whoever's not in power wants to place blame for bad economies, right? It's the way it always is. It's all about politics. The economy's always a political issue. Other political issues come and go. War and peace and abortion and whatever, but the economy is always a political issue. And we don't want our central bank, who's supposed to keep our economy on an even keel. That's why we created them in 1913. See, we're gonna learn in a future chapter that the economy has ups and downs, ups and downs. Always has, always will, nothing we can do to end that. The economy has ups and downs, and we're okay with that, we can live with that. What we don't like is really high ups and really low downs, right? That's annoying. So, we created the Fed in 1913 to try to keep the economy on an even keel. Well, how do they do that? They do that by keeping the money supply correct. Right? If there's too much money, the economy's too high. If there's not enough money, that's called a depression, right? The economy's too low. So we want them to keep it. We know there's gonna be ups and downs, but we want them to be minor humps and lumps, not big ones. Alright, so again, politically independent. So how do we achieve that? Well, who runs the Fed? You tell me.
The board of
The
directors.
Board of Governors. How many members are there?
12.
Seven.
7. How do they get there?
They were picked by the president.
Picked by the president. You say, well, that's all about politics then. Not so fast. Remember, they have 14-year terms, right?
Yeah.
And those 14-year terms are staggered. So that every 2 years, there's an opening. And whoever's president can appoint someone to that Board of Governors that has the same economic philosophy as that president. And in 4 years, they'll get to appoint maybe 4 on the Board of Governors, right? So that way we make sure that the president can't stack the Board of Governors with all people that think the same economic philosophy they do. Best we can do to keep it politically independent. Got that?
Yep.
Alright, when we say the Fed is financially independent, this will blow your mind. They have their own budget and they don't have to ask anybody for it. Alright, now every other department in our government, you'll learn in government class if you don't already know this, Congress controls the budget. And they determine which department gets how much money. State Department, the Department of Defense, NASA, the Environmental Protection Agency, all the little government agencies, big ones and little ones. Congress decides this is your budget, this is how much money you get. Here's all our tax money, here's how we divide it up to all the government agencies. It's all up to Congress. Well, guess what? The Federal Reserve does not get in line and say, could you please give us enough money for our budget like every single other agency. Federal Reserve doesn't do that. They are financially independent. They are not beholden to Congress for their money. They create their own budget. But how do you do that? Well, when their books get to zero, they have no more money left, they erase the zero and write in whatever they want. Start all over. I wish I could do that. When my checkbook gets to zero, erase zero and put in a million and get to spend it again. Unfortunately, we can't do that, right? But the Federal Reserve can. And it's no big deal. It's not a fear, because remember, they're not part of the private sector. They're not trying to make a profit. Their goal is to keep the economy running smoothly. Right? So they're not gonna run out of money. Right? That's not the point. The people on the Board of Governors can't get rich from the Fed. They get paid a salary. They can make a lot more money in the private sector. So it isn't about profit and loss. It's about keeping the economy even. So to do that, we allow them to be financially independent. They don't have to ask Congress for money. If they did, well, then it'd be all about politics again, wouldn't it? And if Congress was the same party as the president, they'd be happy to give the Fed money. If the Congress is a different party as the president, they would never give the Fed money. So the economy would tank and the president get blamed, whatever, right? So we don't do that. They're financially independent. And finally, they're operationally independent. The Federal Reserve basically can do whatever they want with our economy. And they don't have to answer to anybody. Congress cannot tell the Federal Reserve what to do. The president cannot tell the Fed what to do. Drives the president crazy. President Trump will often meet with the chairman of the Fed's Board of Governors. And when the president comes out of the meeting, he's usually angry and he'll do a press conference and he'll talk bad about the Federal Reserve, but can he make them do what he wants? No. He'll tweet about them all the time, but they don't have to listen, because they're operationally independent. Because their job is not to make presidents happy, not to make Congress happy, their job isn't to make we the people happy, because we don't have to vote for them. Their job is to keep the economy running smoothly. So we make them operationally independent. Any questions on that? Their political, financial, or operational independence. Everybody get it? Now we know how they're organized, how they work. Next obvious question is, what exactly does the Federal Reserve do? Right, well, great question. The Federal Reserve has 6 functions. How many functions do they have? 6. The first 5 we're gonna go over are what you might call their secondary functions. The last one we go over, the 6th one, is the primary function of the Fed. That was the real reason the Fed was created. The last one we're gonna go over. The first 5 is kinda like, we said, you know what, if we're gonna have a central bank, we might as well let them help with these 5 things too while we're at it. Alright, so let's look at some of the secondary functions of the Fed. Look at them one at a time. One function of the Fed is to provide a uniform and elastic currency. The currency is that paper money we're talking about, right? That's provided by the Federal Reserve. Dylan, get your dollar out. Wake up, get your dollar out.
Where would the all go?
Oh, man.
If I'm a dog.
Reagan, did you steal it from him? You got it?
Yeah.
Alright, what does it say? Above the United States of America, what does it say?
Federal Reserve note.
There you go. It's a Federal Reserve note. It was provided by the Federal Reserve. That's our currency. We say it's uniform. Uniform means it is accepted by everybody. Why is it accepted by everybody, by the way? We learned that last week. It's legal tender. Alright, we have established it to be legal tender. It must be accepted. It's uniform everywhere you go. That dollar will count as a dollar, and you can get a dollar's worth of goods with it. Alright, when we say elastic currency, we mean we can expand or contract how much paper money is in circulation. Alright, the Federal Reserve can tell those printing presses in Washington, D.C., print more currency. Or they can tell them, quit printing so much currency. Alright, it's elastic. They can expand and contract the money supply. So here in my Federal Reserve coffee mug, I have some Federal Reserve dollars. It's actually $161 shredded. Now, if I could just get some super glue and piece all this together, I'd have $161. But no.
False.
So what they do with the currency is when it gets old and worn out, the Federal Reserve will pull that out of circulation, shred it, sell it as a souvenir, and then print some new ones to replace it. Alright, so it's never all worn out.
I can't believe how much old money's worth. Cause my grandpa found a penny from, I don't know, they called it like a haystack penny or something.
Yeah.
And he sold it for like $25,000. I was like, what the heck?
Yeah. It's kind of like a whole antique thing, right? Values in the mind of the buyer. Subjective. Any questions on how they provide our currency? That's one thing they do. Alright, another thing the Fed does.
Ew. It popped.
This one should sound familiar. The Federal Reserve regulates member banks. Remember that chart we looked at on the bank, the dual system banking we have in our country? National banks are required to be Fed members. State banks get to decide. Most state banks choose not to be members. But all banks, all national banks, and some Fed banks that are federal, or national banks that are Federal Reserve members have to follow the Fed's regulations on the reserve ratio and things like that. Not hard to understand. Another function of the Fed, and this one's interesting, it's not hard to understand, but at least I know when I was your age, I never thought this through. The Fed helps in the check clearing process. I don't know if you ever stop to wonder, or think about this, but let's say that I owe Aaron money, so I write him a check for $100, I owe him $100. Alright, so Aaron takes my check down to his bank and deposits it, right? And his bank will add $100 to his account. That's all fine and good, but what if I bank at a different bank than he does? So my check was written off of my bank. How does my bank know to subtract $100 from my account? That check has to clear, right? What that means is, what that means is that check, that physical check that Aaron got from me, that he gave to his bank, has to end up at my bank. Well, how do they do that? Well, I'll tell you how they don't do it. There's not some guy on a bicycle that hops on his bike and pedals across town to my bank and says, here's a check from Mr. Kiefer, could you subtract $100 from his account? That's not how it happens. Alright, every single bank in town and every single bank in the country sends all the checks that get deposited at their bank to clearing houses. There are clearing houses all over the country. Alright, the entire process is outlined in detail on page 216 and 217 in your textbook. But basically what these clearing houses do is they sort out these thousands upon thousands of checks. You know those little numbers at the bottom of your check, those little computer-like looking numbers? Those are routing numbers. It tells the clearing houses where to send these checks. And then once the checks are cleared, everything's evened out, right? Every bank knows how much to add to a customer's account, and the other banks know how much to subtract from each customer's account, and it's all accounted for. Once the checks are cleared, that would be a big job, wouldn't it? Think of all the checks that are written. And it's not just me and Aaron who might bank in the same town but at separate banks. But think about people that have their banks in other cities, other states. That's a massive undertaking to clear all those checks written every single day. Well, clearinghouses do that. The Federal Reserve is not the only one that clears checks, but remember, it's a secondary function, so we were thinking, if we're gonna have a central bank, there's this big job of clearing checks, we might as well get them to help with that. So there you go. They help the check clearing process. Any questions on that? All right, we're through 3. Fourth function of the Fed. Is the Fed acts as a fiscal agent for the government. That's just a fancy way of saying the Federal Reserve Bank is the government's bank. Right? What does your bank do for you? It accepts your deposit, it extends you loans, it gives you financial advice. Well, guess what? Where does the federal government deposit their money, our tax dollars? Federal Reserve. They can borrow money from the Federal Reserve. They get financial advice from the Federal Reserve. Sometimes the Fed's Board of Governors chairman, and maybe the Secretary of the Treasury, and maybe the President of the United States, the 3 of them will meet together. All right, and the Fed's giving our government leaders financial advice, just like your bank does for you. All right, so the Federal Reserve is fiscal agent for the government. Any questions on that one? All right, one more secondary function of the Fed. Believe it or not, the Fed is also sometimes a bank for banks. Like if your bank needed to borrow money, that's a concept, right? Your bank usually lends money. But what if they needed to borrow money? Who would they borrow it from? Answer, the Federal Reserve, the central bank. It's a bank for banks. And in that role, the Federal Reserve is what we call the lender of last resort in the case of a quote-unquote run on the bank. You might know what a run on the bank means. What if everybody in town went to their bank tonight and said, I want all my money? Like Gabby asked earlier, are you entitled to get all your money?
Yes.
Yeah, it's your money. You put it in there for safekeeping, and now you want it back. You want it out. You're entitled to it. And that's fine. They can handle your account. But if everybody that banks there did that at the same time, they don't have all that money. Why not? What'd they do with it? They loaned it. They have a certain percentage of that. That's the reserve requirement. But when that reserve requirement runs out, and there's still people in line that says, I want my money, that's called a run on the bank. Now, that doesn't normally happen, right? That's not gonna happen tonight, right? But there could be something happen in our world, in our country, that could spark a run on the bank. Everybody gets afraid. Oh my goodness, zombie apocalypse, we better get our money out, right? Or whatever, and then everybody hits the bank at the same time, we got a problem. Well, in that case, the Federal Reserve kicks in, and they are the lender of last resort. In other words, your bank will borrow money from the Fed so that they can meet your demand and give you your money. Doesn't happen often, but that's another role of the Fed in case it does happen. Any questions on that one? All right, those are 5 functions of the Fed. We said there were how many?
6.
6. The final one that we're gonna talk about is the main reason the Fed was created. These, again, it's just like, we're gonna have a central bank, we might as well get the Fed to help with these 5 secondary functions. But the whole reason in 1913 Congress created the Fed is, drum roll, not gonna tell you yet. Sorry,
Can I go back?
you gotta come back tomorrow.
To make the economy run smooth.
You gotta come back tomorrow to get the final function of the Fed and how they accomplish it.